Have you ever looked at a plant or animal and thought, why does it seem to perfectly match its environment? Why do we all look so differently from one another? How did complex features like eyes and hands develop? Or perhaps you wondered about the causes of aging and where our species came from. As Theodosius Stopansky once wrote, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. The answer to so many questions that humans have had about ourselves and the natural world for hundreds of years, an idea that one man made famous that changed the course of scientific thinking forever. Now, before we begin our journey, how can we actually define evolution? What is evolution? Evolution is the change in heritable characteristics of a population over successive generations. The key word here being populations and not individuals. Evolutionary change involves changes to the genetic makeup of a population. But how did this idea of evolution come to be? The famous Charles Robert Darwin, born 1809, was an English naturalist and geologist who is often considered to be the father of evolutionary theory. Now, theory in this scientific context, meaning something that we consider to be true due to the vast amount of supporting evidence available. In 1831, and now this is going to make me feel bad about myself, Darwin, aged 22, a fresh university graduate planning a career with the church, was invited by Captain Fitzroy on board the H.M.S Beagle, a Royal Navy surveying vessel, to chart the unexplored coastlines of South America. On the 27th of December, H.M.S Beagle set sail for what was meant to be a 2-year, but turned into a 5-year-long expedition from the port of Plymouth in England. Now, the first point of interest on Darwin's journey came when they were denied landing in the Canary Islands due to fears of cholera. Darwin was particularly eager to study islands, especially Tenerife, so this came as a major disappointment to him. But by mid-January 1832, Darwin had landed on Santiago in the Cape Verde Islands, giving him his first taste of a tropical ecosystem and volcanic geology. Darwin began to observe the geological formations on the island, the different layering of the rock strata, the lava flows and the marine fossils found in the white limestone layers. His observations, guided by Charles Lyell's principles of geology, converted him to the idea of uniformitarianism, the idea that the Earth had been shaped by long, slow geological processes, something that he later used as a basis for his theory. In 1832, Darwin had landed in Brazil. At Bahia, he had his first taste of a tropical rainforest. He experienced an overwhelming feeling of joy and wonder, and was left in amazement at the sheer variety and diversity of plants and animals that the jungle had to offer. He writes, "Delight itself, however, is a weak term to express the feelings of a naturalist who, for the first time, has wandered by himself in a Brazilian forest," something that I can definitely relate to myself. He began collecting beetles, butterflies, birds and plants, fascinated by their adaptations to rainforest conditions, many of which were also new to science. He describes leafcutter ants in particular detail, inciting thoughts about instinct and behaviour, noting their display of cunning, planning and even cruelty. As he was exploring the complex ecological webs, in Rio de Janeiro, Darwin expressed his horror at the slavery he saw. He writes, "It makes one's blood boil, yet heart tremble, to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty." His view on slavery ended up shaping his ideas of human evolution, conflicting with the contemporary view at the time of differences between savages and civilized man. Sailing south to Argentina, he spent some time with the Gauchos people on the wide open plains of the Pampas. He described a new species of rhea, and he observed fossils of extinct mammals like Glyptodon, Megatherium and Toxodon. He noticed that the fossils were in the same layers of rocks as similar living species, helping to shape further his ideas of evolution. Further south, in Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, more geological observations are made, more fossils were found, and untouched tribes and societies were also discovered in the cold, harsh conditions at the literal end of the world. By the time 1835 had rolled by, The H.M.S Beagle found itself 1,000 kilometres west of Ecuador on the Galapagos Island archipelago. Darwin spent 5 weeks on the islands, and he was immediately struck by the otherworldly volcanic landscape and unique wildlife, many of which were endemic to the islands. Darwin noticed that each island had its own distinct species of mockingbird, the first sign that island populations could evolve independently. He also collected, arguably more famous, over a dozen finch specimens with different beak shapes and sizes. Darwin originally thought that these were varieties of the same species, and it wasn't until later that the ornithologist John Gould classified them as distinct species. Giant tortoises further reaffirmed Darwin's speculations about the idea of species, as he noticed that the locals could tell which tortoise was from which island based on the shape of their shell. The Beagle then journeyed to the Pacific, visiting Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia and the Cocos Islands. Darwin then visited South Africa and a few Atlantic islands before finally returning to England on the 2nd of October 1836. Upon his return, Darwin had abandoned his thoughts about the idea that species was something that was fixed, and he began to develop the ideas that his famous book, The Origin of the Species, would reveal to the world. In 1838, Darwin read an essay by Thomas Malthus written in 1798 titled Principle of Population, which argued that human populations grew faster than the supply of food, which led to competition and struggle. Darwin, having a sort of eureka moment, realised that this principle not only applied to human population, but all of life. He was beginning to think about the idea of natural selection. Now, in order to understand how groundbreaking Darwin's ideas were, it's important to understand how people viewed the natural world at the time. The dominant belief was creationism, the fact that each species was individually created by God and had remained unchanged since its creation. People believed that the natural world was ordered, static and perfect, reflecting a divine plan for all living things. Nervous of scientific and religious backlash, and despite urges from Charles Darwin and other naturalists, it took 20 years for Darwin to publish on The Origin of Species in 1859. The year prior, he had received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, who had also conceived the idea of natural selection, and they presented their ideas together at the Linnean Society in London. Now, why were Darwin's ideas in this book so groundbreaking? Well, it contained two major theories. Number one, that all species, both living and extinct, had descended from a common ancestor, the idea of descent or modification. And two, that natural selection, not creationism or divine intervention, was a chief proponent of evolutionary change. He proposed that species changed over time, that they adapted to their local environments through the inheritance of characteristics and traits over successive generations. He also had the idea that humans had shared ancestry with other animals, but he decided to wait until 1871 when the publication of The Descent of Man to reveal that to an already stunned Victorian public. Darwin fundamentally changed the way people viewed and understood life, nature, and humanity's role within it. He had challenged centuries worth of philosophical, scientific, and religious thought. But there were a few flaws to his theory. Darwin had no mechanism to describe how inheritance worked. Where did these hereditary variations come from? And if only he'd known about a certain Gregor Mendel, who in 1866 introduced the idea of genes through his work with pea plants. But it wasn't until 1900 that Mendel's work was eventually made famous, and there'll be more on that in a later video. The second flaw was that natural selection is not the only proponent of evolutionary change. There are now 5 we now know of, and I'll be explaining them in my next video on how evolution actually works. So how do we understand evolution today? Well, in the following 20th century, scientists such as Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and C.L. Wright used mathematical models and theory to develop ideas about population genetics. Stepansky mentioned at the start of the video produced ideas on genetic variation and change in natural populations. Ernst Mayr, Julian Huxley, George Gaylord Simpson, among others, produced ideas about mutation, genetic drift, migration, and gene flow being the main causes of evolutionary change. Watson and Crick further expanded on our understanding of genetics with the discovery of the structure of DNA. All of these scientists and their ideas come together and combine to form what we call the modern synthesis that forms the basis of evolutionary biology today. Unfortunately, over the last 150 years, many have misused Darwin's theories as justification for social inequality, colonialism, and even eugenics. So-called social Darwinism twisted the idea of survival of the fittest as rationale for racism and class oppression. Darwin opposed slavery and would have never promoted such silly ideas. When we're talking about evolution, it's really important to remember that it's amoral, it's not immoral. There's no evolution from a lower state to a higher state. You know, evolution has no plan or any direction. But how has evolution got on with religion? While some religious groups have completely opposed it, others have sort of embraced it. Belief in God or whatever divine power takes your fancy doesn't have to be mutually exclusive with the idea of evolution. You can believe in one and believe in the other. Today, evolution is a cornerstone of modern biology. It explains the patterns we see in the fossil record, the distribution of species and the behaviour of organisms. It unites all life sciences from genetics to ecology to neuroscience, and it's continually evolving even today, bringing new ideas from developmental biology, genomics and molecular biology. Yet at its core, evolution still remains what it was when Darwin first envisioned it. A simple, elegant idea, but with profound implications. The idea that all life on Earth is connected through a shared history, that species are not static but dynamic and ever-changing, that complexity did not arise from design, but from gradual change over vast stretches of time. Now I started with a quote, so I shall end with one from the man himself. There is grandeur in this view of life. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for my next video on how evolution actually works.